Seraphina's hand flew to her throat instinctively, remembering the night 8 years ago when she had made the desperate choice to stop speaking rather than be claimed by him. Chapter 1. The Stranger's Eyes. The rain hammered against the coffee shop windows as Seraphina pressed herself deeper into the corner booth, her trembling fingers clutching the worn notebook that had been her only voice for 8 long years. Across the crowded cafe, she spotted him, Marcus, her ex-mate, his predatory smile cutting through the warm amber lighting as his eyes locked onto hers. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird as she watched him weave between tables, his massive frame casting shadows over unsuspecting customers. She had been so careful, so invisible, but somehow he had found her again. Marcus's voice boomed across the cafe as he approached, causing several patrons to look up from their laptops. "There's my sweet, silent little mouse," he called out, his tone dripping with false affection that made her skin crawl. Seraphina's hand flew to her throat instinctively, remembering the night 8 years ago when she had made the desperate choice to stop speaking rather than be claimed by him. She could feel the familiar panic rising in her chest as he drew closer, his scent, pine and danger, triggering memories she had fought so hard to bury. Without thinking, Seraphina bolted from her seat, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. She stumbled through the maze of tables, her vision blurring with unshed tears as she heard Marcus's heavy footsteps pursuing her. The cafe's front door seemed miles away as she pushed past a businessman checking his phone, nearly knocking over a woman's purse. Her silent world had become her prison, but it had also been her salvation until now. The familiar weight of helplessness settled over her shoulders like a suffocating blanket. In her desperate flight, Seraphina collided hard with what felt like a wall of granite, strong arms instantly wrapping around her to steady her fall. She looked up through her tears into the most striking pair of golden eyes she had ever seen, eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul with an intensity that stole her breath. The stranger was tall and imposing, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that seemed out of place in the casual coffee shop, his dark hair perfectly styled despite the storm raging outside. There was something ancient and powerful in his gaze, something that made her feel both terrified and inexplicably safe. "Please," she whispered, the first word she had spoken aloud in 8 years tumbling from her lips before she could stop it. The stranger's eyes widened slightly at the sound of her voice, a muscle in his jaw tightening as he looked over her head toward Marcus, who had frozen mid-stride at the sight of them together. The air in the cafe suddenly felt electric, charged with a tension that made the hair on Seraphina's arms stand on end, and she realized with growing dread that her carefully constructed world of silence was about to shatter completely. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in the Philippines, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now, let's dive into the story. The memory crashed over Seraphina like a tidal wave as she stood frozen in the stranger's protective embrace. 8 years ago, she had been young and foolish, believing that Marcus's possessive attention was love rather than the suffocating cage it truly was. The night he had cornered her in the old pack house, his eyes glowing with predatory hunger as he declared his intention to claim her as his mate, she had felt her world crumble. His massive hands had gripped her shoulders so tightly that bruises bloomed like dark flowers across her skin, and when she had tried to refuse, to say the words that would reject his claim, he had threatened to hurt everyone she loved. The decision to stop speaking had come to her in a moment of desperate clarity. If she never spoke aloud again, she could never formally accept or reject a mate bond, leaving her in a strange limbo that even werewolf law couldn't easily navigate. She had walked away from everything that night, her pack, her family, her voice, and any hope of a normal life. The first few months in the human world had been terrifying, learning to navigate a society where she couldn't speak, taking odd jobs and sleeping in shelters while she figured out how to survive without the supernatural strength and community she had always known. Building her new identity had been like constructing a house of cards in a windstorm. She had learned sign language, carried notebooks everywhere, and perfected the art of being forgettable. Just another quiet girl working in bookstores and coffee shops, invisible to the world around her. The humans she worked with had been kind but distant, treating her disability with a mixture of pity and admiration that made her feel even more isolated. She had convinced herself that this half-life was enough, that safety was worth the crushing loneliness that settled in her chest like a stone. But Marcus had never stopped hunting her, appearing like a nightmare every few months, no matter how far she ran or how well she hid. Each time, she would pack her few belongings and disappear again, always staying one step ahead of his relentless pursuit. She had moved from Seattle to Portland to San Francisco, then to smaller towns where she hoped to disappear completely, but his supernatural senses always found her trail. The knowledge that she could never truly escape had worn her down like water against stone, leaving her exhausted and hollow. Now, pressed against this mysterious stranger's chest, breathing in his scent of cedar and rain and something wildly intoxicating, Seraphina felt something she hadn't experienced in 8 long years: hope. There was power radiating from him, ancient and commanding, that made Marcus's threatening presence feel suddenly insignificant. But hope was dangerous for someone like her, she reminded herself, because every time she had dared to imagine safety, Marcus had appeared to steal it away. Yet as she looked up into those impossible golden eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if this time might be different. Damon Thornfield had ruled the supernatural world from the shadows for over 2 centuries, commanding respect and fear from every pack on the continent. But nothing had prepared him for the jolt of electricity that shot through his body the moment the trembling woman collided with his chest. Her scent hit him like a physical blow, wildflowers and rain, and something uniquely her that made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin. He had come to this human coffee shop to escape the endless political machinations of his court, seeking a moment of peace in his carefully constructed disguise as a successful businessman, but fate seemed to have other plans. The moment she whispered that single, desperate word, "Please," something fundamental shifted in his carefully ordered world. Her voice was like honey and smoke, rusty from disuse, but achingly beautiful, and the vulnerability in her green eyes made his protective instincts roar to life with startling intensity. Behind her, he could sense the other wolf's presence, could smell the bitter tang of obsession and violence that clung to the man like a second skin. Every fiber of his being demanded that he eliminate the threat immediately, but he forced himself to remain calm, to assess the situation before acting. Damon's golden eyes hardened as they fixed on Marcus, and he felt his wolf's power unfurling like smoke through the air, invisible to humans, but unmistakable to supernatural senses. The other werewolf froze mid-step, his nostrils flaring as he caught the scent of an alpha far more powerful than anything he had ever encountered. Smart enough to recognize a predator when he saw one, Marcus's confident swagger faltered, replaced by the wary tension of a wolf who suddenly realized he was outmatched. The cafe around them continued its normal rhythm, humans oblivious to the supernatural drama unfolding in their midst. "I believe the lady asked you to leave her alone," Damon said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make Marcus step back involuntarily. His words were calm and measured, but underneath lay a promise of violence that made the air itself seem to vibrate with tension. He could feel the woman, Seraphina, he somehow knew her name though she hadn't spoken it, trembling against his chest, and something primal and possessive unfurled in his gut. She felt fragile as spun glass in his arms, yet there was a core of steel in her that spoke of years of survival against impossible odds. As Marcus retreated toward the door, shooting dark looks over his shoulder, Damon found himself reluctant to release his hold on the mysterious woman who had quite literally fallen into his life. There were questions burning in his mind. Why was she running? Why did her voice sound unused? And why did every instinct he possessed scream that she was meant to be his? But for now, he contented himself with the way she fit perfectly against him, as if she had been made to fill the hollow space in his chest he hadn't even realized existed. The storm outside matched the tempest brewing in his soul as he realized his carefully controlled world was about to change forever. Seraphina pulled away from the stranger's embrace with reluctance, her body already missing the warmth and safety she had found in his arms. The golden-eyed man, who had introduced himself simply as Damon, was studying her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see through all the carefully constructed walls she had built around herself. She reached for her notebook with shaking hands, scrawling a quick thank you across the page before holding it up for him to read, hating how the simple gesture reminded her of all the words she had locked away. "Your voice," Damon said softly, his deep baritone sending shivers down her spine. "You can speak. Why do you choose not to?" The question hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. For 8 years, she had perfected the art of deflection, of changing the subject or simply walking away when people got too curious about her silence. But something in his golden gaze made her want to tell him everything, to unburden herself of the weight she had been carrying alone for so long. Instead, she wrote carefully in her notebook, "It's safer this way," and watched as his eyes darkened with understanding and something that looked remarkably like fury. He didn't press for more details, seeming to sense the fragility of the moment, but she could see questions burning in his expression. Outside, the storm was growing worse, rain lashing against the windows with increasing violence, and she realized with a sinking heart that she would have to venture out into it soon. Marcus would be waiting somewhere nearby, he always was. "Let me drive you home," Damon offered, and the simple kindness in his voice nearly broke her careful composure. She shook her head quickly, writing "too dangerous" in her notebook, but he intercepted the page before she could show it to him. His fingers brushed hers as he took the pen, writing beneath her words, "For who? Him or me?" The question made her breath catch, because there was something wild and dangerous lurking beneath his polished exterior, something that called to parts of herself she had forgotten existed. When she finally looked up from the notebook, Seraphina found herself drowning in those impossible golden eyes, and for a moment, she could almost imagine what it would be like to trust someone again. The rational part of her mind screamed warnings. She knew nothing about this man except that he was clearly not entirely human, and her track record with supernatural beings was catastrophically bad. But as thunder crashed overhead, and she watched him carefully slide her notebook back across the table, his movements graceful and predatory, she realized that for the first time in 8 years, she didn't want to run away. She wanted to follow him straight into whatever beautiful disaster he represented, even if it destroyed her. 3 days later, Seraphina stood behind the counter of Moonlight Books, the small independent bookstore where she had found work 2 weeks ago, when the familiar scent of pine and menace drifted through the door. Her hands stilled on the inventory sheet she had been updating, every muscle in her body tensing as Marcus stepped into the cozy space, his massive frame seeming to devour the warm lighting and peaceful atmosphere. He moved between the towering shelves like a predator stalking prey, his eyes never leaving her face as he approached the counter with that horrible, possessive smile that haunted her nightmares. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the front windows seemed to dim in his presence, as if darkness followed him wherever he went. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever, little sister?" Marcus asked, leaning across the counter until she could feel his hot breath against her cheek. The word hit her like a physical blow, making her stumble backward until her spine pressed against the bookshelf behind the register. "Surprised? Dear old dad never told you about his bastard son, did he? The one he threw away while keeping his precious legitimate daughter. You have what should have been mine, the bloodline, the power, the recognition. But when I claim you, when our children carry both sides of father's legacy, I'll finally have what I was denied." The elderly owner, Mrs. Chin, had stepped out for lunch, leaving Seraphina completely alone with her tormentor, and she could see the calculated timing in his cruel eyes. The revelation crashed over her like an avalanche, memories she had buried deep suddenly clawing their way to the surface with vicious clarity. She remembered whispered conversations between her parents that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms, the way her father's face would darken whenever certain pack names were mentioned, the strange sadness in her mother's eyes during family gatherings. There had been another child, she recalled fragments now, a boy with Marcus's dark hair who had lived on the edges of pack territory with his mother, acknowledged but never claimed, tolerated but never loved. The boy who had watched her from the shadows during pack celebrations, his eyes burning with a hunger she had been too young to understand. Marcus's massive hand slammed down on the counter, making the antique register jump and causing several customers to look up from their browsing with concerned expressions. "Look at me when I'm talking to you," he snarled, his voice carrying the authority of an alpha despite his bastard status. "You remember now, don't you? The brother father never wanted you to know about. The son he cast aside because my mother wasn't pack royalty like yours." His fingers traced the edge of the counter with deliberate menace, claws just barely visible beneath his human facade. "I used to watch you during the full moon celebrations, all dressed up in your pretty white dresses while I stood in the shadows with the other unwanted children." The normalcy of the bookstore felt like a fragile bubble that Marcus's presence threatened to shatter completely, but now it carried an even more sinister weight. This wasn't just obsession. This was family dysfunction twisted into something monstrous and predatory. Seraphina's mind reeled as she tried to process the implications of what he was telling her. If Marcus was truly her half-brother, then his pursuit of her wasn't just about claiming a powerful mate. It was about correcting what he saw as a cosmic injustice, taking by force what he believed should have been his birthright. The thought made her stomach churn with revulsion and terror. "Father always said bloodlines were everything," Marcus continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that made her skin crawl. "Pure bloodlines create the strongest alphas, the most powerful lunas. But he never understood that bastard blood carries the same power when it's returned to its source." His eyes gleamed with a madness that spoke of years of resentment and carefully nursed grievances. "When I claim you, when we create children together, they'll carry the full legacy of our father's line. The pack will have to acknowledge what they tried to deny, that I am worthy of the power that runs in our veins." Seraphina's hand trembled as she reached for the notebook she always kept close, but her fingers felt clumsy and disconnected as the full horror of her situation crystallized. She wasn't just being hunted by an obsessed ex-mate, she was being stalked by her own blood, family turned predator in the most twisted way possible. The notebook fell from her nerveless fingers as memories continued to surface. The way Marcus had always seemed to know exactly where to find her no matter how far she ran, how he understood her habits and preferences with unsettling accuracy. The familiar cruelty in his eyes that she now recognized as an echo of their father's darker moments. "Please leave. I'm working," she managed to write on a scrap of paper, but Marcus's laugh was a harsh bark that echoed off the high ceilings. He crumpled the page before she could finish the sentence, his movements sharp and violent. "Still pretending to be mute, little sister? Still playing the victim when you're sitting on a throne of power that should have been shared?" His fingers wrapped around her wrist with bruising force, and she could feel the familiar panic rising in her throat like bile. 8 years of running had taught her that there was nowhere Marcus wouldn't follow, no sanctuary he wouldn't violate in his obsessive quest to claim her as his mate, but now she understood the true depth of his madness. "You spoke to him, didn't you?" Marcus snarled, his grip tightening until she was certain her bones would snap. "I could smell him all over you that night at the cafe. Some rich human who thinks he can protect you from what you really are, from what we really are." His words dripped with jealous venom, and Seraphina realized with growing horror that he had been watching her even more closely than she had imagined. The thought that Marcus had seen her moment of weakness, her desperate plea to Damon, made her stomach churn with shame and fear, but now it carried an additional layer of violation. Her own brother had been stalking her like prey. "Do you have any idea what it was like?" Marcus whispered, his voice taking on a wounded quality that was somehow more terrifying than his rage. "Watching you grow up with everything that should have been mine? The pack's love, father's acknowledgement, the respect that comes with legitimate birth." His free hand traced the air above her face without quite touching, a gesture that spoke of years of obsessive observation. "I memorized every expression, every laugh, every tear. I made myself into the perfect mate for you, learned everything about your preferences and fears. I became worthy of our bloodline while you squandered it on silence and hiding. The customers in the bookstore had begun to notice the tension at the counter, their conversations quieting as they sensed the predatory atmosphere that surrounded Marcus like a dark aura. An elderly man near the poetry section kept glancing over with concerned eyes, his hand hovering near his cell phone as if debating whether to call for help. A young mother gathered her toddler closer, instinctively moving toward the children's section in the back of the store. The normal human world continued around them, oblivious to the supernatural drama unfolding in their midst, but even they could sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the scene playing out before them. Our father destroyed my mother, you know, Marcus continued, his voice gaining intensity as old wounds bled fresh. Filled her head with promises about acceptance and recognition, then cast her aside the moment she became inconvenient. She died believing he would claim me eventually, that I would take my rightful place in the pack hierarchy. But he never even acknowledged my existence after her funeral. His eyes burned with unshed tears that somehow made him look even more dangerous. I swore on her grave that I would have what was mine by right, that I would prove our bloodline's worth even if I had to take it by force. Seraphina felt trapped between horror and pity as she stared into the face of her half-brother, seeing echoes of their father's features twisted by years of resentment and pain. Part of her wanted to feel sympathy for the abandoned child he had been, but the predatory hunger in his current expression reminded her that he had chosen this path of violence and obsession. Whatever justification he told himself, he had decided that her autonomy was less important than his wounded pride, that her body was a prize to be claimed rather than a person to be respected. I researched everything about mate bonds, Marcus said, his academic tone at odds with the violence in his grip. The ancient laws, the bloodline requirements, the loopholes that could be exploited. When I realized what you were, a Luna Prime with our father's royal blood, I knew fate had given me the perfect opportunity for justice. You would be mine, our children would be the most powerful alphas ever born, and the pack would finally understand that casting me aside was their greatest mistake. His thumb pressed against her pulse point, feeling the rapid flutter of her terrified heartbeat. Your silence was just a minor inconvenience. I had time to wait, to plan, to become strong enough to claim what I deserved. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Seraphina's heart leaped as she recognized the familiar scent of cedar and rain that had haunted her dreams for the past 3 days. Damon stepped into the bookstore like an avenging angel, his expensive suit pristine despite the gray drizzle outside, and his golden eyes immediately zeroed in on Marcus's punishing grip on her wrist. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as his gaze hardened, taking in not just the physical threat but the emotional devastation written across Seraphina's face. Even the other customers seemed to sense the sudden shift in atmosphere, quietly gathering their things and heading for the exit as if their survival instincts warned them to flee. Marcus's hold on her wrist loosened slightly as he turned to face this new threat, but Seraphina could feel the violence coiling in his muscles like a spring ready to snap. Well, Marcus said, his voice taking on a mocking tone as he assessed Damon with predatory calculation. The rich human returns to play hero. Tell me, sister dear, have you told your knight in shining armor about our family connection? Does he know he's interfering in a private family matter? The word family dripped with poisonous satisfaction, and Seraphina saw Damon's eyes narrow as he processed the implications of Marcus's words. Let her go, Damon said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of authority that made Marcus's shoulders tense with instinctive recognition. Something in Damon's perfectly controlled posture suggested a predator far more dangerous than the snarling wolf who held her captive. And Seraphina felt a flutter of hope mixed with terror at the thought of what might happen when these two supernatural forces collided. The bookstore had become a battleground, and she was trapped at the center of a war that had been 8 years in the making. Family business, Marcus repeated, tightening his grip on her wrist until she gasped with pain. Our dear father may have failed to claim his bastard son, but I'm going to succeed where he failed. The bloodline will be united, one way or another. His words were a challenge and a threat rolled into one, and as Damon began to move forward with deadly intent, Seraphina realized that her carefully hidden past was about to explode into violence that would shatter the fragile safety she had built around herself forever. Damon's eyes blazed molten gold as he took in the scene before him, Seraphina's terrified expression, the way she cradled her obviously injured wrist, and the possessive stance of the wolf who dared to lay hands on what his every instinct screamed belonged to him. For 3 days, he had been consumed with thoughts of the mysterious woman who had stumbled into his life, using his considerable resources to learn everything he could about her while respecting her obvious need for space. But seeing her in distress shattered his careful restraint like glass, and he could feel his wolf clawing at the edges of his control, demanding blood. "I believe you're frightening the customers," Damon said mildly, though his voice carried an undertone of authority that made Marcus's shoulders tense with recognition. He moved through the bookstore with predatory grace, each step calculated to position himself between Seraphina and her tormentor while appearing completely casual to any human observers. The few remaining customers seemed to sense the tension crackling in the air, hastily completing their purchases and fleeing into the safety of the rainy afternoon, leaving the 3 supernatural beings alone among the towering shelves. Marcus straightened to his full height, trying to project dominance, but Damon could smell the fear beneath his bravado. "This doesn't concern you, human," Marcus growled, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes as he struggled to reconcile Damon's expensive suit and polished appearance with the waves of power rolling off him. The younger wolf's nostrils flared as he tried to place Damon's scent, his face paling as he realized this was no ordinary human businessman. The bookstore felt like a powder keg waiting for a spark, supernatural tension thrumming through the air like electricity. "Everything concerning her concerns me," Damon replied softly, and the possessive edge in his voice made both Seraphina and Marcus freeze. He could see the shock in her green eyes, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. Behind the counter, she looked impossibly small and fragile, yet there was something in her expression that suggested she was fighting her own battles, waging war against fears and instincts he was only beginning to understand. The protective rage burning in his chest threatened to overwhelm his careful control. When Marcus took a threatening step toward Seraphina, Damon moved faster than human eyes could follow, his hand closing around the other wolf's throat with crushing force. The bookstore's antique floorboards groaned under the supernatural tension as Damon's true nature leaked through his carefully maintained facade, his golden eyes beginning to glow with an otherworldly light. "Touch her again," he whispered, his voice dropping to a lethal purr, "and I'll show you exactly why lesser wolves learn to kneel." The promise of violence hung in the air like smoke, and Seraphina realized with growing certainty that the man who had been haunting her thoughts was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Seraphina watched in stunned silence as Damon released Marcus with a casual flick of his wrist, sending the larger man stumbling backward into a display of romance novels. The golden glow in Damon's eyes faded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving her wondering if she had imagined the supernatural light or if her carefully hidden world was finally colliding with the human facade she had built. Marcus clutched his throat, his face flushed with humiliation and rage, but something in Damon's relaxed posture warned him against retaliation. The air still hummed with residual power, making the hair on her arms stand on end as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. The revelation about Marcus being her half-brother still felt like an open wound in her chest, raw and bleeding with implications she wasn't ready to face. Every childhood memory had been tainted by his confession, every moment of safety she had felt growing up now poisoned by the knowledge that her own blood had been watching from the shadows with predatory intent. The way Damon had moved to protect her without hesitation spoke of instincts that went beyond normal human responses, and she found herself caught between gratitude and a growing certainty that nothing in her life was what it seemed. "This isn't over," Marcus snarled, his voice hoarse from Damon's grip, but his retreat toward the door belied his threatening words. He shot Seraphina a look filled with such venomous promise that she instinctively stepped closer to Damon's protective presence, her body seeking shelter without conscious thought. "You can't hide behind him forever, little sister." Eventually, you'll have to face what you really are, what we really are. The bell above the door chimed with violent finality as he stormed out into the rain, but his parting words hung in the air like a curse, reminding her that this was merely a temporary reprieve from a nightmare that would follow her forever. The silence that followed felt deafening after the storm of supernatural tension, broken only by the gentle patter of rain against the windows and the soft ticking of the antique clock on the wall. Seraphina's mind reeled as she tried to process everything that had happened in the span of minutes: Marcus's horrific revelation, Damon's inhuman display of power, and the growing certainty that her carefully constructed world of normalcy was crumbling around her like a house of cards. The familiar comfort of the bookstore felt foreign now, contaminated by violence and secrets that made her question everything she thought she knew about her life. Damon turned to her with concerned eyes, his earlier violence replaced by a tenderness that made her heart ache with longing and confusion. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently, reaching toward her injured wrist before stopping himself, as if he understood that she needed to grant permission for his touch after everything she had just endured. The contrast between his protective fury and his careful gentleness left her feeling dizzy and overwhelmed, caught between terror and an inexplicable sense of safety that defied all logic. His very presence seemed to calm something wild and frightened in her chest, even as her rational mind screamed warnings about trusting anyone in her current situation. Seraphina found herself nodding, then shaking her head, unable to articulate the complex tangle of emotions churning in her chest like a storm-tossed sea. Her wrist throbbed where Marcus had gripped it with bruising force, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the terror of knowing he would never stop hunting her. That his obsession was rooted in family dysfunction, so twisted it made her stomach churn with revulsion. The knowledge that she had been running from her own half-brother for 8 years added layers of violation and horror to her situation that she hadn't even known were possible. She reached for her notebook with trembling fingers, her handwriting shaky as she tried to process her thoughts into coherent questions. "How did you know to come here?" she wrote, the question feeling loaded with implications she wasn't ready to face. His timely arrival couldn't be coincidence. Marcus had been right about one thing: Damon had appeared at exactly the moment she needed him most, like some kind of guardian angel materializing from thin air. The possibility that he had been watching her, protecting her from shadows she hadn't even known existed, should have terrified her, but instead it filled her with a strange sense of relief. After 8 years of running alone, the idea that someone had been looking out for her felt like a gift she didn't deserve, but desperately needed. "I've been keeping an eye on you," Damon admitted without shame, his golden gaze steady and unflinching as he watched her process his words. There was no apology in his tone, no attempt to soften the reality of his surveillance, and somehow his honesty made it easier to accept than any gentle lie would have been. "After what happened at the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that you were in danger. Something about the way that man looked at you, the fear in your eyes, it triggered every protective instinct I possess." He paused, studying her face with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see straight through to her soul and all the secrets she carried there. The admission should have made her angry, should have triggered all her carefully honed survival instincts about men who watched and followed and claimed to know what was best for her. Instead, she felt a treacherous flutter of warmth in her chest at the knowledge that someone had cared enough to worry about her safety, that she hadn't been as alone as she thought during these past few days of uncertainty. The rational part of her mind reminded her that protective behavior could easily become controlling, that Marcus had probably justified his stalking with similar reasoning. But there was something fundamentally different about the way Damon spoke of watching over her. "There are things about me you don't know, Seraphina," he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper that made her pulse quicken with anticipation and fear. "Things that might frighten you. But I need you to understand, I will never let him hurt you again." The words carried weight beyond their simple meaning, layered with implications about his true nature and the power she had witnessed him display. She could see the careful control he maintained over himself, the way he held his body with predatory stillness that spoke of barely leashed violence, and she realized that whatever he was, he was far more dangerous than Marcus could ever hope to be. The promise in his voice was absolute, carved in stone and sealed with something that felt remarkably like fate, but before Seraphina could respond, Mrs. Chen's voice drifted from the back room, speaking in an ancient language that made the air shimmer with power like heat waves rising from summer pavement. The words were melodic and complex, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones despite her complete inability to understand their meaning. Seraphina spun around to see the elderly woman emerging from the storeroom, her normally stooped posture straightened with regal bearing as her eyes glowed like molten amber in the afternoon light. "The ward is broken, young king," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying an authority that made both Seraphina and Damon freeze with recognition. "I sent the call when the hunter entered my sanctuary." The elderly woman's accent had disappeared completely, replaced by the crisp diction of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Her weathered hands moved in complex patterns as she spoke, and Seraphina could see faint trails of golden light following her gestures, like afterimages burned into her retinas. The transformation was so complete that she felt like she was looking at a completely different person wearing Mrs. Chen's familiar face. "Did you think I hired you by coincidence, child?" Mrs. Chen asked, turning those glowing amber eyes on Seraphina with gentle amusement. "I've been guarding your bloodline for 70 years, waiting for him to find you." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, making her stumble backward until her spine pressed against the counter for support. Every assumption she had made about her life, every moment of safety she had felt in this bookstore, had been carefully orchestrated by forces she couldn't begin to understand. The job she thought she had earned through her own merits, the sanctuary she believed she had found through luck, had all been part of some elaborate supernatural protection scheme. 70 years? Seraphina whispered, her voice cracking as she spoke aloud for the second time in 8 years. The words felt foreign on her tongue, rusty and uncertain, but the shock of Mrs. Chen's revelation had stripped away her carefully maintained silence like a physical blow. "But you're only..." She trailed off, realizing how ridiculous the question sounded in light of everything else she had just learned. If Damon could display inhuman strength and speed, if Marcus could track her across the country with supernatural persistence, then Mrs. Chen being far older than she appeared was merely another impossible thing in a day full of impossibilities. Mrs. Chen's laugh was like silver bells chiming in the wind, musical and ancient and filled with secrets that spanned decades. "I am much older than I appear, dear one. Old enough to remember when your grandmother first manifested her Luna Prime abilities, old enough to have served your great-grandmother before her." She moved toward them with fluid grace that belied her elderly appearance, each step revealing the supernatural being that had been hiding beneath the facade of a harmless bookstore owner. "I am what your kind calls a guardian, an ancient being tasked with protecting certain bloodlines until they can fulfill their destiny." The air in the bookstore felt thick with power now, crackling with energies that made Seraphina's skin tingle with electricity. Books on the shelves rustled as if touched by an invisible breeze, and the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows seemed to bend and shift around Mrs. Chen's form like she was made of something more substantial than mere flesh and bone. The familiar space that had been her refuge for 2 weeks had transformed into something out of a fairy tale, magical and dangerous and utterly beyond her understanding. "A guardian," Damon repeated, his voice filled with recognition and something that might have been awe. "I thought your kind were myths, legends told to young alphas to teach them about the old ways." He moved closer to Seraphina, his protective instincts clearly triggered by this new revelation, but there was respect in his posture as he regarded Mrs. Chen. "What are you exactly? Dragon? Phoenix? Something older?" The casual way he discussed mythical creatures as if they were merely exotic animals made Seraphina's head spin with the implications of how much she didn't know about the world she lived in. "Phoenix," Mrs. Chen confirmed with a smile that revealed teeth that seemed to gleam with inner fire. "Though I prefer my human form these days. Less dramatic than my ancestors, perhaps, but better suited to blending into modern society." She gestured around the bookstore with obvious affection. "I've grown quite fond of this little sanctuary I've built." The books hold such wonderful stories, such power in their words and ideas. It seemed fitting to guard a wordless child in a place dedicated to the preservation of language and literature. Seraphina felt tears burning behind her eyes as the full scope of the deception hit her with devastating force. Every kindness Mrs. Chin had shown her, every gentle smile and patient gesture, had been part of some cosmic duty rather than genuine affection. The job she had been so grateful for, the sense of belonging she had felt in this place, had all been carefully constructed illusions designed to keep her safe and compliant. The knowledge that even her refuge had been predetermined made her feel like a chess piece being moved around a board by players she couldn't see or understand. "You manipulated me," she said, her voice gaining strength with anger and hurt. "You made me think I was safe here, that I had found something real, but it was all just another cage." The words tasted bitter on her tongue, flavored with the betrayal of discovering that even her small victories had been orchestrated by others. She had been so proud of finding work on her own, of building a small life independent of the supernatural world that had traumatized her, but now she understood that she had never truly escaped it all. Mrs. Chen's expression softened with genuine sorrow, the ancient being's facade cracking to reveal something achingly human beneath the supernatural power. "Oh, sweet child, no. The job was real, your skills were genuine, and my affection for you has been entirely authentic. I simply encouraged certain circumstances to align in your favor." She reached out as if to touch Seraphina's face, then stopped herself when she saw the young woman flinch away. "I have watched over your bloodline for 7 decades, seen 3 generations of Luna Primes grow from children into powerful women. I have never become personally attached to any of them until you." "The wards around this place," Damon said quietly, his golden eyes scanning the bookstore with new understanding. "I felt them the moment I approached, but I assumed they were simple protection spells. You've created something much more sophisticated than that, haven't you?" His tone carried professional appreciation, as if he understood the complexity of what Mrs. Chin had accomplished in ways that Seraphina couldn't even begin to grasp. The conversation felt like it was happening in a foreign language, full of concepts and implications that made her feel like a child trying to understand adult politics. "This entire block sits on a convergence of ley lines," Mrs. Chin confirmed with obvious pride. "I've spent 40 years carefully weaving protections into the very foundations of the building, creating a sanctuary that most supernatural beings cannot even perceive, much less enter without invitation. Marcus was only able to breach the outer perimeter because of his blood connection to Seraphina. Family bonds can overcome many magical barriers." She turned to look directly at Seraphina, her amber eyes blazing with ancient power. "That's why I sent the call to your mate when the ward was broken. I knew you would need protection beyond what my magic could provide." "My mate?" Seraphina's voice cracked on the words, her eyes flying to Damon's face as she tried to process this latest revelation. The golden-eyed man who had saved her twice now was watching her with an expression of careful hope, as if her reaction would determine something crucial about their future. The word mate carried implications that made her chest tight with panic and something that might have been longing, suggesting bonds and commitments that went far beyond the simple attraction she had been trying to ignore. "The bond was obvious from the moment he first touched you," Mrs. Chin said gently, her ancient wisdom evident in the knowing smile that curved her lips. "I could smell it on both of you, the beginning of something that would grow into the strongest mating bond I've witnessed in centuries. You were made for each other, literally designed by fate to complete one another's souls." She gestured between them with hands that sparkled with residual magic. "That's why I felt safe allowing him to approach despite my duty to keep you hidden. True mates cannot harm each other, not in any way that matters." The revelation that their connection was somehow predestined should have terrified her, should have triggered all her carefully developed fears about men who claimed ownership over her choices and her body. Instead, she found herself looking into Damon's golden eyes and seeing not possession but partnership, not control but protection freely offered. The way he had defended her from Marcus, the careful way he sought permission before touching her, the obvious effort he made to give her space to make her own decisions. Everything about his behavior suggested a man who understood that true strength came from supporting rather than dominating. "I don't understand any of this," Seraphina admitted, her voice small and overwhelmed as she looked between the two supernatural beings who had apparently been orchestrating her life from the shadows. "Guardians and mates and bloodlines and ancient laws. I just wanted to work in a bookstore and be left alone. I never asked for any of this." The words carried 8 years of exhaustion and fear, the weight of constantly running from a destiny she had never wanted or understood. She felt like she was drowning in revelations and expectations, pulled between forces beyond her control or comprehension. Mrs. Chen's expression gentled with maternal tenderness, the ancient being's power banks to reveal something achingly compassionate. "None of us ask for the roles fate assigns us, dear one. But running from your nature will only lead to more pain, more years of hiding and fear. The Luna Prime bloodline is a gift, not a curse, though I understand it may not feel that way given your experiences with that twisted boy who shares your blood." She moved closer, her presence radiating warmth and safety despite the supernatural power that hummed beneath her skin. "You have choices now that you didn't have before, real choices, made with full knowledge of what you are and what you're capable of becoming." The afternoon light streaming through the bookstore windows had taken on an ethereal quality, as if the very air was charged with magic and possibility. Seraphina stood at the center of it all, feeling like she was balanced on the edge of a precipice with her old life on one side and an unknown future on the other. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken questions and the weight of decisions that would shape not just her own destiny, but the fate of the supernatural world that had been hidden from her for so long. Damon's penthouse apartment overlooked the city like a fortress in the sky, its floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the sprawling metropolis below through sheets of rain that seemed to weep against the glass. Seraphina stood in the center of the vast living space, feeling impossibly small among the luxury that surrounded her, leather furniture that probably cost more than she had earned in years, original artwork adorning the walls, and a view that made her feel like she was standing on top of the world. She had followed him here in a daze, her rational mind screaming warnings while her instincts insisted she had never been safer in her life. Even as the revelations from the bookstore continued to spiral through her consciousness like a tornado of impossible truths. The ride up to the penthouse had been conducted in silence, both of them still processing the magnitude of what Mrs. Chen had revealed about her true nature and the supernatural forces that had been shaping Seraphina's life from the shadows. The elevator had been equipped with security measures that went far beyond simple keypads. Damon had pressed his palm against what looked like ordinary metal, but she had felt power pulse through the air as ancient protections recognized him and granted access. The building itself hummed with barely perceptible energy that made her newly awakened supernatural senses tingle with awareness, suggesting defenses that would make it nearly impossible for unwanted visitors to reach this sanctuary in the clouds. "You don't have to stay," Damon said quietly from behind her, though she could hear the hope threaded through his carefully neutral tone. The words carried weight beyond their surface meaning, acknowledging that she had been given enough shocking revelations for one day and might need space to process everything she had learned about herself and the world she thought she understood. "But Marcus won't look for you here. This building has security measures he can't breach." He didn't elaborate on what those measures might be, but something in his voice suggested they went far beyond typical human protection, involving the same supernatural forces that had made Mrs. Chen's bookstore an invisible sanctuary. The apartment felt like a sanctuary, insulated from the dangerous world below by more than just height and steel, and she found herself reluctant to leave this bubble of safety he had created around her. Everything about the space spoke of careful planning and unlimited resources. The furniture was arranged to provide clear sightlines to all entrances. The windows were obviously reinforced beyond normal building standards, and she could sense layers of protection woven into the very walls like invisible shields. It was the kind of security that only someone with intimate knowledge of supernatural threats would think to implement, confirming her growing suspicion that Damon was far more than the wealthy businessman he pretended to be. Seraphina turned to find him watching her with those impossibly golden eyes, his expensive suit replaced by dark jeans and a simple black sweater that somehow made him look even more dangerous than his formal attire had. Without the polished businessman facade, she could see the predatory grace in his movements, the carefully leashed power that hummed beneath his skin like electricity waiting to be unleashed. The casual clothes revealed the true breadth of his shoulders, the corded muscle in his forearms, and the way he held himself with the absolute stillness of an apex predator, completely confident in his ability to handle any threat that might arise. He had offered her sanctuary without asking for anything in return, and the generosity of it left her feeling overwhelmed and vulnerable in ways she hadn't experienced in years. After 8 years of running, of constantly looking over her shoulder and never allowing herself to truly relax, the idea of safety felt almost too good to be true. Yet everything about Damon's behavior suggested genuine concern for her well-being rather than the calculated manipulation she had learned to expect from powerful men. The way he had defended her from Marcus, his careful respect for her boundaries, and the obvious effort he made to give her choices rather than demands, all of it spoke to a character that defied her worst expectations. The silence between them stretched comfortably as she explored the living space, her fingers trailing over surfaces that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Original paintings adorned the walls, not reproductions or prints, but actual masterpieces that belonged in museums rather than private homes. The furniture was clearly custom-made, sized and positioned with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of someone who understood both aesthetics and function. Everything was beautiful but also practical, luxury balanced with the kind of security considerations that most people would never think to implement. "This is incredible," she wrote in her notebook, then hesitated before adding, "But why do you live like you're expecting a siege?" The question felt presumptuous, but the apartment's defensive qualities were too obvious to ignore. Every window offered multiple escape routes, the layout provided excellent tactical advantages, and she was beginning to recognize the subtle signs of supernatural protections layered throughout the space. It was the home of someone who had made powerful enemies and taken steps to ensure they could never reach him in his private sanctuary. Damon's laugh was rich and warm, carrying notes of genuine amusement rather than the careful politeness she might have expected. "Occupational hazard," he said simply, settling onto the leather couch with fluid grace that reminded her of a large cat arranging itself in a patch of sunlight. "When you've lived as long as I have, you learn that paranoia and preparation are the keys to survival." The casual mention of his longevity sent another jolt of recognition through her supernatural senses, confirming what she had already suspected about his true nature, while raising a dozen new questions about exactly what he was and how old he might be. She pulled out her notebook, writing carefully, "Why are you helping me?" The question felt inadequate to capture the depth of her confusion, but it was a start. In her experience, protection always came with a price, and she had learned to be suspicious of kindness that seemed too good to be true. Men like Marcus had taught her that gestures of care and protection could quickly transform into chains of possession and control, that what looked like sanctuary could become a prison if she let her guard down completely. Yet as she watched Damon read her words, the gentle understanding in his expression made her chest tight with an emotion she was afraid to name. "Because you need help," he answered simply, patting the cushion beside him in invitation while being careful not to make the gesture feel like a command. "And because from the moment you fell into my arms, I haven't been able to stop thinking about you." The honesty in his admission made her breath catch, the raw vulnerability in his voice suggesting depths of emotion that went far beyond simple attraction or supernatural instinct. "There's something about you, Seraphina, something that calls to parts of myself I thought I'd lost centuries ago. You make me want to be better than I am, to be worthy of the trust you're considering giving me." The admission hung between them like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross, weighted with implications that made her heart race with equal parts terror and hope. She moved toward the couch slowly, hyper-aware of every step as she navigated the space between fear and trust that had defined her existence for so long. When she finally settled beside him, careful to maintain some distance even as every cell in her body seemed to gravitate toward his warmth, She felt like she was performing an act of courage that rivaled anything she had done in 8 years of running and hiding. Outside, the storm continued to rage with supernatural intensity, rain lashing against the reinforced windows with enough force to make even the sturdy building sway slightly in the wind. Lightning split the sky in brilliant displays that illuminated the city below in stark relief, and thunder rolled across the metropolitan landscape like the footsteps of angry gods. The weather seemed to echo the turmoil in her own heart, the clash between the safety she felt in Damon's presence and the rational voice in her head that insisted she couldn't trust anyone completely, not after everything she had endured. "Tell me about yourself," she wrote, then added after a moment's hesitation, "the real you, not the businessman facade." The request felt bold and presumptuous, but she needed to understand who she was trusting with her safety and potentially her future. If Mrs. Chin was right about their connection being predetermined by fate, if the bond between them was as significant as the ancient guardians seemed to believe, then she deserved to know exactly what she might be getting herself into by accepting his protection. Damon was quiet for a long moment, his golden eyes distant as he seemed to weigh how much truth he was ready to share. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries and secrets that had shaped him into the man he had become. "I'm old, Seraphina. Older than I look, older than most beings you'll ever meet. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched the world transform in ways that would seem like magic to previous generations. I've made mistakes that haunt me still, decisions that cost lives and destroyed futures I thought I was protecting." His hands clenched slightly as he spoke, betraying the emotional cost of the memories he was sharing. "I've spent most of my existence alone by choice, convinced that isolation was safer for everyone involved. Power like mine tends to corrupt, to turn even the best intentions into justifications for terrible acts. I told myself I was protecting the world by staying distant from it, by ruling from the shadows rather than engaging directly with the people I was supposed to serve." He turned to look at her directly, his golden eyes blazing with intensity that made her breath catch. "But then you fell into my arms in that coffee shop, and for the first time in centuries, I felt like I might be capable of something better than mere survival." The raw honesty in his words stripped away her defenses like armor being peeled away piece by piece, leaving her feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She could see the genuine emotion in his expression, the way his carefully maintained control seemed to fracture around the edges when he looked at her. This wasn't the polished charm of a practiced manipulator. This was someone offering her pieces of his soul, and hoping she wouldn't use them as weapons against him. "What are you exactly?" she wrote, her curiosity finally overcoming her caution as she studied his perfect features and the way shadows seemed to bend around him even in the well-lit apartment. The question felt intimate and dangerous, like she was asking him to remove the last of his masks and show her something that might change everything between them. But if she was going to trust him with her life, if she was going to consider the possibility that Mrs. Chin might be right about their destined connection, then she needed to understand exactly what she was dealing with. "I'm a werewolf," he said simply, though the casual way he delivered the revelation suggested depths of complexity that went far beyond the simple label. "But not just any werewolf. I'm what my kind calls an alpha king, the leader of all pack territories in North America. I've held that position for over 3 centuries, maintaining the balance between the supernatural world and the human societies that exist alongside us without knowing we're here." His transformation was subtle but unmistakable as he spoke, his human facade shifting just enough to reveal glimpses of the predator that lived beneath his civilized exterior. The revelation should have terrified her, should have sent her running for the door despite the storm raging outside and the dangers that waited in the world beyond his protection. Instead, she felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with satisfying precision, his inhuman speed and strength, the way other supernatural beings responded to his presence, the casual mention of centuries of existence, and the absolute authority in his voice when he had commanded Marcus to release her. Everything about him made perfect sense now, explained through the lens of supernatural power and responsibility that went far beyond anything she had imagined. Mrs. Chin was right, wasn't she? She wrote, her handwriting slightly shaky as she processed the implications of everything she had learned. About us being mates? The word felt foreign and dangerous on the page, carrying implications that made her heart race with equal parts terror and longing. The idea that their connection was somehow predetermined by forces beyond their control should have made her feel trapped, but instead it felt like validation of the inexplicable pull she had felt toward him from the moment they met. When she finally looked up from the notebook, Damon's golden eyes suddenly blazed with fury that had nothing to do with her question, and everything to do with something he was sensing that she couldn't perceive. "There's magic on you," he growled, his nostrils flaring as his supernatural senses detected something that made every protective instinct in his body roar to life. Old magic. A binding curse. The words hit her like physical blows, and she felt her blood turn to ice as suppressed memories began flooding back with devastating clarity. A hooded figure in the forest chanted words in a language she didn't recognize. Marcus's triumphant smile as her voice was stolen from her throat like a physical thing being ripped away. She hadn't chosen silence. It had been chosen for her, forced on her by supernatural means that had made her believe the decision was her own. The revelation shattered everything she thought she knew about her own choices and agency, leaving her drowning in the horrifying realization that even her greatest act of defiance had been nothing more than an illusion carefully crafted by her enemies. The room spun around her as 8 years of carefully constructed identity crumbled like sand, and she realized that the nightmare she had been living was even worse than she had ever imagined. Damon watched Seraphina explore his kitchen with cautious curiosity, her fingers trailing over the marble countertops and professional-grade appliances with something approaching wonder. He had ordered dinner from her favorite restaurant, a detail she hadn't questioned, but that spoke to the depth of his surveillance. And was now preparing tea with movements that seemed almost domestic despite the supernatural tension crackling between them. Every gesture she made was graceful yet guarded, like a wild creature that had learned to move through a world designed to trap it, and his wolf paced restlessly at the edges of his consciousness, demanding he claim and protect what was clearly his. The notebook lay open on the counter between them, filled with her careful script as they had navigated the careful dance of conversation over dinner. She had told him about her work at the bookstore, her love of old poetry, the way she found solace in words even when she couldn't speak them aloud, but the important questions remained unasked, hovering in the air like ghosts. He could see the curiosity in her green eyes when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she seemed to catalog his every movement as if searching for clues to a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Seraphina," he said carefully, setting down his teacup with deliberate precision. "I need to tell you something about what happened today. About what I am." The words felt heavy on his tongue, weighted with centuries of secrecy and the knowledge that once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. She froze at his tone, her cup halfway to her lips, and he could see the careful walls she had built around herself beginning to rise in anticipation of another blow. He hated that he was the one who would have to shatter the fragile peace they had found in his sanctuary. She reached for her notebook, writing quickly, "I know you're not entirely human. The way you moved, your eyes. I'm not blind." The admission hung between them like a bridge, and he felt something tight in his chest loosen at her unexpected acceptance. Of course she had noticed. Anyone who had lived on the edges of the supernatural world would recognize the signs, even if they had spent years trying to forget them. Her next words made his heart stop. "I'm not entirely human either. That's why Marcus won't let me go." The notebook trembled in her hands as she wrote her next confession. "I'm a werewolf. Was a werewolf. I don't know what I am anymore." The pain in those carefully formed letters made his chest ache with protective fury, and he finally understood the depth of her sacrifice. She had cut herself off from her very nature to escape Marcus's claim, had chosen a half-life of silence over the brutal alternative he represented. The magnitude of her courage left him speechless, even as his wolf howled with recognition and desperate need to comfort its mate. Damon's revelation hung in the air between them like a thunderclap. He was the Alpha King, ruler of all supernatural territories in North America and the most powerful werewolf on the continent. Seraphina stared at him in stunned silence, her notebook forgotten on the marble counter as she processed the impossibility of her situation. The man who had saved her, who had offered her sanctuary and protection, was the very being whose laws she had been hiding from for 8 years. The irony was so complete it would have been laughable if her entire world wasn't crumbling around her once again. "The binding you're trapped in," Damon continued, his voice gentle despite the authority that seemed to radiate from his very bones, "it's not recognized under current pack law. Marcus has no legal claim to you, especially since you never formally accepted his proposal." He moved closer, his golden eyes burning with intensity as he searched her face for understanding. "But your silence has created a loophole that allows him to continue pursuing you. Under ancient law, if you don't formally reject him within a decade of his initial claim, his right to hunt you becomes absolute." The words hit her like physical blows, each revelation worse than the last. She had thought her silence was protection, but it had only been a temporary reprieve, buying her time while the supernatural legal system slowly closed around her like a trap. Her hands shook as she reached for her notebook, writing with desperate urgency. "How long do I have?" The question felt like a countdown to her own execution, and she could see the answer in Damon's eyes before he spoke it aloud. 2 years, he said quietly, and the finality in his voice made her legs weak. "But there's something else you need to know. The reason Marcus's claim has any validity at all." He paused, running a hand through his dark hair as if the next words caused him physical pain. "You're not just any werewolf, Seraphina. Your bloodline is ancient, powerful. You're what we call a Luna Prime, a female capable of bearing children who could become alpha kings or queens. Marcus knows this. It's why he's been so relentless in his pursuit." The revelation shattered the last of her carefully constructed understanding of herself and her place in the world. All these years, she had thought she was just an ordinary wolf running from an obsessive ex-mate, but the truth was far more dangerous and complex. She was a living treasure in the supernatural world, a prize that ambitious wolves would kill for, and Marcus had been hunting not just her body, but the legacy she could provide him. The notebook slipped from her nerveless fingers as she realized that even Damon's protection might not be enough to save her from the destiny written in her very blood. The silence stretched between them like a chasm as Seraphina struggled to process the enormity of what Damon had revealed about the supernatural world that had been hidden from her understanding for so long. She felt like a chess piece suddenly discovering the scope of the game being played around her, every move she had made for the past 8 years part of a larger strategy she had never understood or consented to participate in. The man sitting across from her wasn't just her unexpected savior. He was the most powerful being in her world, someone who could command the very laws she had been running from with desperate futility. The knowledge should have terrified her, should have triggered every survival instinct she had developed during her years of hiding, but instead, she found herself studying his face with growing fascination. Searching for any sign of the manipulation she had learned to expect from powerful men who claimed to want to help her. The revelation about the curse that had stolen her voice still reverberated through her consciousness like aftershocks from an earthquake, shaking the very foundations of everything she thought she knew about her own choices and agency. 8 years of believing she had chosen silence as a form of protection, 8 years of thinking her muteness was an act of defiance against a world that had tried to control her. And now she discovered it had all been an elaborate deception orchestrated by the very forces she had been trying to escape. The violation felt deeper than anything Marcus had done to her physically, a theft of her very identity that left her questioning every decision she had made since that terrible night in the forest. Damon had explained the mechanics of the curse with clinical precision, his supernatural senses allowing him to trace the magical signatures that had been woven into her very essence, like invisible chains. The spell had been crafted with diabolical cleverness, designed not just to steal her voice, but to make her believe the loss was voluntary, that she had made a conscious choice to embrace silence rather than fight against the bonds that held her captive. The false memories implanted by the magic had been so complete, so seamlessly integrated with her genuine trauma, that even now she struggled to separate what had been real from what had been artificially constructed. "You're what we call a Luna Prime," Damon had told her, his voice heavy with the weight of knowledge that would change everything about how she understood herself and her place in the supernatural hierarchy. A werewolf female born with the power to unite packs, to strengthen bloodlines, and to channel the kind of ancient magic that most of our kind have forgotten ever existed. You're incredibly rare. There might be 3 or 4 Luna Primes born in a century, and most never realize their full potential because they're claimed and mated before they can come into their power completely. The explanation had made her feel like a prize to be won rather than a person to be cherished, a supernatural lottery ticket that every alpha in the continent would kill to possess. She understood now why Marcus had been so relentlessly determined in his pursuit, why he had been willing to spend 8 years hunting her across the country with single-minded obsession. She wasn't just his half-sister or a potential mate. She was a weapon of unimaginable power that could reshape the entire supernatural world if wielded by someone with the ambition and ruthlessness to use her abilities without regard for her consent or well-being. "But there's something else," Damon continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper that somehow carried more weight than if he had shouted the words. The intensity in his golden eyes suggested he was about to share a secret that went to the very core of who he was, something that would fundamentally alter the dynamic between them in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Something I've never told another soul in 3 centuries of existence." His hands clenched slightly on the marble countertop, and she could see the careful control he maintained over himself beginning to fracture around the edges as he prepared to expose his deepest vulnerability. "You're not just any Luna Prime, Seraphina," he said, each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment. "You're the last daughter of the original moon goddess bloodline, the bloodline my ancestors were created to serve and protect. Every Alpha King for 3 centuries has been searching for you, waiting for you to manifest your powers so they could claim you and unite the supernatural world under their rule." His voice carried a mixture of awe and desperation that made her chest tight with emotions she couldn't name. "I was literally born to find you, to be yours. That's why I recognized you instantly, why every instinct I possess screams that you're mine." The revelation hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making the room spin around her as she tried to process the implications of what he was telling her. She wasn't just rare, she was unique, the last of a bloodline that had shaped the supernatural world for millennia before disappearing into legend and myth. The weight of that legacy, the expectations and responsibilities that came with such a heritage, felt crushing in their magnitude. She had spent 8 years trying to escape her supernatural nature, and now she discovered that she carried the blood of actual deities in her veins. "The moon goddess bloodline," she whispered, her voice cracking as she spoke the words that felt too large and powerful for her human throat to contain. The name resonated in her bones like an echo of something ancient and vast, awakening instincts and knowledge that had been dormant in her DNA for generations. She could feel power stirring in her chest, responding to the acknowledgement of her true heritage like a sleeping dragon opening one massive eye. "That's why the curse was so strong, isn't it? It wasn't just binding my voice, it was suppressing my entire supernatural nature." Damon nodded grimly, his expression dark with barely contained rage at the forces that had tried to diminish her into something manageable and controllable. "The moon goddess bloodline carries power that goes far beyond normal Luna Prime abilities. In your true form, you could command any werewolf regardless of pack allegiance, heal supernatural wounds that would be fatal to others, and channel enough raw magical energy to reshape entire territories according to your will. He paused, studying her face carefully as if gauging her reaction to the magnitude of her potential. That's why Marcus was so desperate to claim you before your 20th birthday. After that, your powers would be too strong for any binding curse to contain permanently. The knowledge that her birthday had been a deadline rather than just another day felt like another violation, another way that her life had been manipulated by forces she couldn't control or escape. She thought about all the times over the past year when she had felt strange surges of energy, moments when her supernatural senses had seemed sharper than usual, instances when she had inexplicably known things about people or situations that she shouldn't have been able to perceive. Those hadn't been random occurrences, they had been her true nature fighting against the magical chains that held it captive, her goddess heritage refusing to be completely suppressed no matter how powerful the curse might be. Your ancestors, she said slowly, pieces of an impossibly complex puzzle beginning to click into place in her mind. They were created to serve the moon goddess bloodline? What does that mean exactly? The question felt dangerous, loaded with implications about destiny and predetermination that made her heart race with equal parts terror and fascination. If what he was suggesting was true, then their connection went far beyond simple attraction or even supernatural mate bonds. They were part of an ancient covenant that had been written into their very DNA. Damon's expression grew distant, as if he was looking back through centuries of family history and genetic memory to find the truth buried beneath layers of legend and carefully guarded secrets. The first Alpha Kings weren't born, they were made, crafted by the moon goddess herself to serve as guardians and protectors for her daughters when they walked among the mortal werewolf packs. We carry her magic in our bloodlines, diluted through generations but still present, still calling us to fulfill our original purpose. His golden eyes blazed with intensity as he focused on her face. That's why no Alpha King has ever taken a mate. We've been waiting for you, for the return of the bloodline we were created to serve. The revelation that he had remained unmated for 3 centuries, waiting for her specifically rather than simply being unable to find someone compatible, added layers of pressure and expectation that made her feel like she was drowning in the weight of cosmic significance. She wasn't just choosing a mate, she was potentially fulfilling an ancient prophecy, stepping into a role that had been empty for generations while supernatural beings across the continent waited to see how she would reshape their world. The responsibility felt crushing, far too large for someone who had spent 8 years working in coffee shops and bookstores while trying to remain invisible. I never asked for any of this, she said, her voice gaining strength as anger began to burn through the overwhelming confusion and fear that had dominated her emotional landscape since Damon had first revealed the truth about the curse. I didn't choose to be born with goddess blood, I didn't consent to having my voice stolen by magical bindings, and I certainly never agreed to be some kind of supernatural breeding stock for ancient bloodlines. Her hands clenched into fists as she spoke, and she could feel power responding to her emotional state, making the air around her shimmer with barely visible energy. I know, Damon said quietly, his tone carrying genuine understanding and sympathy that helped ease some of the rage building in her chest. And I'm not asking you to accept any of this because of ancient covenants or bloodline obligations. What I'm offering you is choice, real choice, made with full knowledge of what you are and what you're capable of becoming. He leaned forward slightly, his entire attention focused on her with laser-like intensity. You could walk away right now, disappear into the human world, and never look back. I would make sure Marcus could never find you, that no other supernatural being would ever threaten your peace again. The offer felt genuine, backed by the kind of power that could actually make such promises meaningful, but she could see the cost it would exact from him written in the careful tension of his posture. If she chose to disappear, he would honor that decision even though it would mean spending eternity alone, waiting for a mate who would never return to claim her heritage and fulfill the ancient bonds that connected their bloodlines. The sacrifice he was willing to make for her autonomy felt staggering in its generosity, so different from Marcus's violent demands and possessive obsession. There is a way to end this, Damon said quietly, his golden eyes never leaving her face as he prepared to offer her the alternative that could reshape both their destinies. A permanent solution that would put you beyond Marcus's reach forever, that would give you the power to protect yourself and others from anyone who might try to use your heritage against you. She could hear the careful control in his voice, see the tension in the way his hands rested on the counter. And her heart began to race with anticipation and dread as she recognized that whatever he was about to propose would change everything between them irrevocably. "Mate with me," he continued, the words falling like stones into still water, creating ripples that would spread far beyond this moment in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. "Accept my claim, let me mark you as mine, and no other wolf would dare challenge your status. As my Luna Queen, you would be untouchable, protected by laws older than human civilization, and backed by power that could remake the supernatural world according to your will." The proposal hung between them, simple and devastating in its implications, carrying the weight of centuries and the promise of a future that would be entirely different from anything she had ever imagined for herself. She could see the careful neutrality he was trying to maintain, the way he attempted to present the offer as a logical solution to her problems rather than an emotional plea for her acceptance. But underneath that controlled exterior, she caught glimpses of something raw and desperate that made her breath catch in her throat, genuine emotion that spoke of feelings far deeper than political maneuvering or supernatural instinct. This wasn't just about fulfilling ancient prophecies or claiming a powerful mate. There was something achingly personal in the way he looked at her, as if her answer would determine not just her fate, but his as well. Seraphina's hand flew to her throat, where she could almost feel the phantom weight of a mating mark, the permanent brand that would declare her claimed and protected, but also owned in ways that went far beyond human understanding. The irony wasn't lost on her. To escape one possessive male, she would have to bind herself to another. Trading Marcus's violent obsession for Damon's overwhelming power and the crushing weight of expectations that came with being the Luna Queen of all North American werewolf packs. Her notebook lay forgotten on the counter as she stared at him, seeing the careful hope he was trying to hide, the way his supernatural stillness couldn't quite mask the tension radiating from his frame like heat from a forge. "I know how it sounds," Damon said softly, misreading her silence as rejection and rushing to explain himself before she could voice the refusal he thought was coming. "I'm asking you to trust me with everything, to bind yourself to someone you barely know despite everything you've endured at the hands of men who claim to care about you." But Seraphina, he reached across the counter, his fingers hovering just above hers without quite touching, respecting her boundaries even as he made his most desperate plea. "This isn't just about protection or ancient bloodlines or supernatural politics. What I feel for you, what you make me feel when you look at me like I might actually be worthy of your trust. I've waited 3 centuries to find you, and I won't pretend this is purely altruistic." The honesty in his admission stripped away the last of her defenses, leaving her drowning in golden eyes that promised both salvation and surrender in equal measure. She could see the genuine emotion burning beneath his careful control, the way his entire being seemed focused on her response, as if nothing else in the world mattered beyond her next words. The weight of his feelings, the magnitude of what he was offering and asking for in return, felt both terrifying and exhilarating in ways that made her heart race with possibilities she had never allowed herself to imagine. The crash of shattering glass pierced the sanctuary of Damon's penthouse like a scream, followed by the acrid scent of smoke that made Seraphina's supernatural senses flare with alarm. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging the luxury apartment into darkness broken only by the hellish orange glow creeping under the door. Emergency lighting kicked in with a mechanical hum, bathing everything in an eerie red wash that made shadows dance across the walls like demons. The building's fire alarm began to wail, a sound that seemed to echo the panic clawing at her chest. "He found us," Damon snarled, his human facade completely abandoned as his eyes blazed molten gold in the crimson light. The air around him shimmered with barely contained power, and Seraphina could hear the bones in his hands cracking as claws pushed through his fingertips. She had never seen him like this, wild and dangerous and utterly inhuman, and the sight should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a strange sense of completion, as if she was finally seeing the real man beneath the careful mask he wore for the world. From somewhere far below came the sound of howling, not human, not quite wolf, but something caught between the two that raised every hair on her body. Marcus had brought others with him, she realized with growing horror, enough to breach whatever supernatural protections Damon had placed on his territory. The elevator shaft echoed with the sound of claws against steel, punctuated by snarls and the occasional human scream from other floors. The building had become a hunting ground, and they were trapped at the very top with nowhere left to run. "The safe room," Damon commanded, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an alpha king as he grabbed her hand and pulled her toward what she had assumed was a closet door. His touch sent electricity shooting up her arm, but she barely noticed in her terror as the sounds of destruction grew closer. The hidden room beyond the door was lined with steel and silver, equipped with enough weapons to outfit a small army and communications equipment that hummed with subtle power. This wasn't just a panic room, it was a war room. "They'll break through eventually," Damon said grimly, loading silver bullets into a pistol with practiced efficiency. "Marcus is too desperate to give up easily, and he's obviously found allies willing to challenge my authority." He turned to her, his golden eyes blazing with fierce protectiveness and something that looked remarkably like regret. "Seraphina, I need you to understand, if we don't make it out of this, if something happens to me, there are others who will protect you. My beta, my pack, they'll honor your status as my intended mate even without the formal bond." The words hit her like ice water, making her realize that for all his power, even the Alpha King could fall. The steel door to their sanctuary shuddered under repeated impacts, each blow accompanied by Marcus's voice raised in a howl of frustrated rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. "I can smell you in there, little mouse. You can't hide behind your pretty boy forever." His words were punctuated by the screech of claws against metal, and Seraphina could see stress fractures beginning to spider across the reinforced barrier. The safe room that had seemed impregnable moments ago now felt like a tomb, and she realized with crystal clarity that their time was running out. Damon stood with his back to the door, weapons arranged around him with military precision, but his golden eyes never left her face as he waited for her answer to his proposal. The emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across his aristocratic features, making him look like some ancient god of war preparing for his final battle. "The choice has to be yours," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of destruction. "I won't claim you out of desperation or fear. But if you're willing, if you can find it in yourself to trust me, I can end this forever." The truth crystallized in her mind like ice forming on glass. She was going to die tonight either way. Marcus would never stop hunting her, would never accept her rejection, and even if Damon somehow defeated him, there would be others who coveted what she represented. The only question was whether she would die as herself, free but alone, or as someone's mate, bound but protected. Her hand moved to her throat, where she could imagine the weight of a mating mark, permanent and possessive, but also sacred in ways she had never allowed herself to consider. "I've been silent for 8 years, she whispered, her voice rusty, but clear in the confines of their steel sanctuary. "I've been running, hiding, pretending to be something I'm not because I was too afraid to face what I really am." The words felt like breaking chains, each syllable a small rebellion against the fear that had ruled her life for so long. Damon's eyes widened at the sound of her voice, hope and wonder warring with the deadly focus of a predator preparing for battle. "Yes," she said more firmly, the word ringing out like a bell despite the chaos surrounding them. "I choose you. I choose to stop running." The moment the acceptance left her lips, something fundamental shifted in the air around them, an ancient power awakening as old as the first wolves who had learned to love. Damon's eyes blazed with triumph and possessive hunger as he moved toward her, his human mask finally falling away completely to reveal the alpha who had ruled the supernatural world for 3 centuries. The choice was made, the die cast, and as the door began to buckle under Marcus's assault, Seraphina realized she had never felt more alive. The air between them crackled with ancient power as Damon's hands framed her face with reverent gentleness, his golden eyes asking one last silent question that would determine the course of both their destinies. Seraphina nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom as she tilted her head to expose the curve of her neck, offering him access to the spot where his mark would brand her as his for all eternity. The gesture felt monumental, a surrender and a claiming rolled into one that would transform her from a hunted refugee into the most powerful female in the supernatural world. The formal words of acceptance felt heavy on her tongue, weighted with centuries of tradition and supernatural law that stretched back to the very foundations of werewolf society. I accept your claim, Alpha King. Make me yours. The steel door behind them gave an ominous groan under the relentless assault from Marcus and his pack, the reinforced metal beginning to buckle despite the supernatural protections Damon had woven into every surface of his penthouse sanctuary. Time felt suspended between heartbeats as she waited for the claiming that would either save them both or damn them to a fate worse than anything Marcus could devise. But in that crystalline moment of anticipation, her half-brother and his hunters felt like distant thunder compared to the storm building between her and the Alpha King who had sworn to protect her with his life. Damon's teeth pierced her skin with exquisite precision, finding the exact spot where her pulse fluttered beneath the delicate flesh of her throat. And fire raced through her veins like liquid lightning as the mating bond snapped into place with the force of destiny finally fulfilled after centuries of waiting. She gasped his name, her voice breaking on the syllables as their souls intertwined in ways that made their previous connection seem like mere physical attraction rather than the cosmic force that now bound them together beyond any possibility of separation. Every emotion he had ever felt crashed through her consciousness in a tsunami of shared experience, 3 centuries of loneliness, the desperate hope he had carried since first catching her scent, the fierce protectiveness that now burned in his veins like acid, and beneath it all, a love so profound and absolute that it threatened to drown her in its intensity. She could feel his wolf recognizing hers through the mystical connection that had formed between them, calling to the part of her nature she had suppressed for so long under the weight of Marcus's threats and the magical bindings that had stolen her voice. The ancient power that flowed between them awakened instincts and abilities that had been dormant since childhood, when she had first begun to manifest the supernatural gifts that marked her as something far more significant than an ordinary werewolf. Through their bond, she could sense the vast network of pack connections that stretched across the continent, thousands of werewolves who now recognized her as their ultimate authority simply by virtue of her mating with their supreme leader. The mark on her throat blazed with silver fire that was visible even through her clothes, the ancient magic sealing their bond beyond any possibility of breaking as it carved itself into her very essence with supernatural permanence. Power coursed through her body like molten metal filling a mold, awakening abilities that had been dormant for 8 years of self-imposed exile from her werewolf nature and the cosmic responsibilities that came with her divine heritage. Her vision sharpened until she could see every detail of the safe room with supernatural clarity that revealed layers of reality hidden from normal perception. Her hearing expanded to catch sounds from floors below and miles beyond. And strength flowed through her muscles like liquid steel that made her feel capable of reshaping the world with her bare hands. The half-life she had been living for the past 8 years shattered completely like glass struck by lightning, replaced by something wild and magnificent and utterly hers in ways that no amount of running or hiding had ever achieved. She could feel the curse that had bound her voice dissolving like sugar in rain, the magical chains that had suppressed her true nature crumbling before the onslaught of power that came with accepting her role as Luna Queen. Every supernatural ability that had been stolen from her or forced into dormancy came roaring back with interest, flooding her consciousness with capabilities she had never dreamed possible during her years of believing herself to be nothing more than a broken refugee. Luna Queen, Damon breathed against her throat, his voice rough with emotion and the aftermath of the claiming that had fundamentally altered the supernatural landscape of an entire continent. The title felt like a crown settling around her shoulders, heavy with responsibility, but also blazing with power she had never dared to imagine could be hers to wield. Through their new bond, she could feel his absolute devotion like a flame that would burn until the end of time, his willingness to burn the world to ash if it meant keeping her safe. And the knowledge both terrified and exhilarated her in ways that made her feel more alive than she had in years of hiding and fear. She was no longer prey running from predators who saw her as nothing more than a prize to be claimed or a weapon to be wielded. She was an apex predator in her own right, marked and claimed by the most powerful alpha in North America and invested with authorities that stretched back to the very origins of their species. The transformation was so complete and overwhelming that she felt like she was seeing the world clearly for the first time in her adult life, understanding finally that all her running and hiding had been nothing more than a prolonged delay of the destiny that had been written into her DNA from the moment of her birth. From somewhere far below came the sound of howling that spoke of reinforcements arriving to support Marcus's assault on the penthouse, voices raised in supernatural harmonies that made the building shake with their combined power. But as Marcus burst through the compromised steel door with his followers snarling at his back, Seraphina's heart stopped cold as she recognized faces that shattered her newfound sense of security like a hammer striking crystal. 3 of the wolves behind him wore Damon's pack colors, wolves she had shared meals with during her brief time in his household, laughed with during quiet moments of apparent safety, trusted completely as part of the extended family that came with accepting the Alpha King's protection. Surprised? Marcus laughed at Damon's expression of absolute betrayal, his voice carrying notes of triumph that spoke of long-planned revenge finally coming to fruition. Your own Beta Council believes a Luna Prime is too dangerous for any one Alpha to control, no matter how powerful he might be. They've been feeding me information for months, planning to eliminate us both tonight and claim the bloodline for the greater good of all packs. His words hit like physical blows, revealing a conspiracy that went far deeper than simple obsession or family dysfunction, extending into the very heart of the supernatural power structure that Damon had spent centuries building and maintaining. The betrayal cut through their newly formed bond like a knife, sending waves of anguish and rage that threatened to overwhelm Seraphina's consciousness as she felt Damon's pain as acutely as if it were her own. She could see the shock and hurt in his golden eyes as he stared at wolves he had considered family, subordinates he had trusted with his life and the safety of his territory for decades or even centuries. The careful control he maintained over his supernatural nature cracked visibly, revealing glimpses of the ancient predator that lived beneath his civilized exterior. Something so dangerous and primal that even Marcus's followers took involuntary steps backward despite their superior numbers. Thomas, Damon said quietly, addressing a gray-haired beta who had served as his second-in-command for over 50 years. Marcus is lying, isn't he? Tell me this is some elaborate deception, that you haven't spent months planning to murder your Luna Queen before she could even properly claim her position. His voice carried the weight of centuries of leadership and the desperate hope that his faith in his people hadn't been completely misplaced, but the guilty expressions on the faces of his former allies told the story more clearly than any words could have managed. She's too powerful, Thomas replied, his voice heavy with the weight of difficult decisions and political calculations that prioritized the stability of the supernatural world over the lives of individuals. The prophecies speak of what a true Luna Queen could do if she chose to reshape pack territories according to her will. No single alpha should have access to that kind of power, not even you, my king. The council believes it would be better to preserve her bloodline through more manageable offspring while eliminating the current generation before it can upset the balance we've maintained for centuries. The clinical way he discussed her murder and forced breeding made Seraphina's stomach churn with revulsion, but also awakened a rage so profound that the air around her began to shimmer with barely contained power. She could feel the moon goddess heritage in her blood responding to the threat, ancient magic that had shaped the supernatural world for millennia rising to defend itself against those who would seek to control or diminish it. The mark on her throat blazed brighter as her emotions intensified, silver fire that spoke of power beyond anything these betrayers could hope to contain or redirect. You would murder your Luna Queen to preserve your own political comfort, she asked, her voice carrying harmonics that made every werewolf in the room flinch with instinctive recognition of her authority. The words resonated with supernatural power that had been building in her bloodline for generations, waiting for someone strong enough to channel it properly. You would betray the Alpha King who has protected your territories and your people for 3 centuries because you fear losing your positions in a hierarchy that was always meant to serve the greater good rather than your personal ambitions? The Beta Council members, wolves she had begun to think of as extended family during her brief time in Damon's protection, couldn't meet her eyes as the full weight of her disappointed authority settled over them like a physical force. She could see the moment when several of them began to doubt the wisdom of their conspiracy, recognizing that they had underestimated both her power and the bonds that connected her to their Alpha King. The mating mark that blazed on her throat wasn't just a symbol of possession, it was a declaration of war against anyone who would threaten the stability of their union. The old ways are dead, Marcus snarled, his patience with political maneuvering apparently exhausted as he stepped forward with claws extending from his fingertips. Talking about prophecies and ancient bloodlines won't change what's going to happen here tonight. Whether these fools help me or not, you're going to watch your precious mate die before I claim what should have been mine from the beginning. His eyes blazed with the madness that had driven him to pursue her across the continent for 8 years, obsession and resentment twisted into something that barely resembled sanity. But Seraphina was no longer the frightened refugee who had fled from him in terror year after year, no longer the broken woman who believed her silence was her only protection against a world that sought to use her for purposes she couldn't control. The power flowing through her veins sang with possibilities that stretched far beyond simple survival, and, through her bond with Damon, she could feel the vast network of loyal packs who would answer their call for aid if given the opportunity. She stepped forward to stand beside her mate, her voice carrying the authority of her new position as she addressed the assembled threats with calm certainty. "You're wrong about many things, brother," she said, the word brother dripping with contempt that made Marcus flinch as if struck. "But most importantly, you're wrong about who's going to die tonight." The silver fire around her intensified as she spoke, power that had been suppressed for too long finally finding its proper outlet. "I am Luna Queen now, marked and claimed by the Alpha King, and invested with authorities that go back to the very foundations of our species. And the first royal decree I make is that anyone who threatens my mate or my people forfeits their right to live." The words rang through the penthouse with supernatural force that made the windows rattle and the floor vibrate beneath their feet, carrying power that spoke of divine heritage finally claiming its birthright. The steel door finally gave way completely with a shriek of tortured metal, but instead of providing the entrance Marcus had been counting on, it revealed the faces of loyal pack members who had come in response to the distress calls that had been automatically triggered when the penthouse's defenses were breached. The betrayers suddenly found themselves outnumbered and surrounded, their carefully planned conspiracy crumbling as the true scope of Damon's support network became apparent. The mating bond that connected her to Damon pulsed with shared determination and the kind of love that could reshape the world, giving her strength she had never dreamed possible and purpose that went far beyond simple survival. She was no longer running from her destiny. She was embracing it with both hands, ready to use every ounce of power at her disposal to protect the people she loved and create a future where supernatural beings could thrive without fear of betrayal from within their own ranks. The battle for her freedom and her future was about to begin, but for the first time in 8 years, she felt truly ready to fight. Marcus's roar of fury shook the entire penthouse as the reality of his defeat crashed over him like a tidal wave, his carefully laid plans crumbling to ash in the face of a bond that superseded every law and tradition he had counted on. "You little whore," he snarled, his human form rippling as his wolf fought for dominance, muscles bulging and bones crackling as he began the shift into his beast form. "I'll kill him and take you anyway, mark or no mark." The threat was hollow, and they all knew it, but desperation had driven him beyond reason, beyond the instinctive fear that should have sent him running from an Alpha King's territory. Damon stepped forward with lethal grace, his own transformation beginning as shadows and silver fire danced around his form. "You dare threaten my Luna?" His voice dropped to an inhuman growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building, carrying the weight of 3 centuries of absolute power. The other wolves in Marcus's pack whimpered and backed away, their inferior instincts recognizing a predator so far above them that challenging him was tantamount to suicide. But Marcus was beyond such rational calculations, driven mad by obsession and the knowledge that his life's goal had slipped through his fingers forever. The 2 alphas circled each other in the ruins of the safe room, supernatural power crackling between them like lightning, and Seraphina felt her newly awakened abilities singing in response to the violence about to unfold. Through the mating bond, she could feel Damon's cold fury, his clinical assessment of Marcus as a threat to be eliminated rather than a rival to be respected. There was no honor in this fight, no complex pack politics, just a rabid wolf who needed to be put down before he could hurt what belonged to the Alpha King. Marcus struck first, his partially shifted form launching across the room with inhuman speed, claws extended and fangs gleaming in the emergency lighting. But Damon moved like smoke and shadow, centuries of combat experience making his response seem almost casual as he caught Marcus mid-leap and slammed him into the steel wall hard enough to leave a crater in the reinforced metal. "You never understood," Damon said conversationally, his golden eyes blazing as his claws extended to rest against Marcus's throat. "She was never yours to claim. She has always been mine." The sound of sirens was growing closer, human authorities drawn by the chaos Marcus had unleashed on the building, and Seraphina realized that this supernatural war was about to spill into the human world with potentially catastrophic consequences. Through her bond with Damon, she could feel his awareness of the approaching danger, his calculation of how many innocents might be caught in the crossfire if this battle continued. Marcus's remaining followers were already backing toward the destroyed doorway, their loyalty crumbling in the face of their leader's obvious defeat, and she knew the smart play would be to let him go, to end this without more bloodshed. But the newly awakened wolf in her soul howled for justice, for an end to 8 years of running and fear. Power surged through Seraphina's veins like liquid starlight as she stepped forward, her voice ringing with the authority of her new position as Luna Queen. "Enough," she commanded, and the single word carried such supernatural weight that both alphas froze mid-struggle, their wolf instincts responding to the absolute dominance in her tone. Marcus's eyes widened in shock and growing terror as he finally understood what she had become. Not just Damon's mate, but a power in her own right, transformed by the ancient bloodline he had sought to possess into something far beyond his ability to control or claim. "You wanted me to speak," Seraphina continued, each word falling like a judge's gavel as she embraced the full magnitude of her transformation. 8 years you hunted me, terrorized me, made me believe I had to choose between my voice and my freedom. But you never understood what you were really chasing." The mating mark on her throat blazed with silver fire as her dormant Luna abilities fully awakened, turning her from victim to queen in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Through the bond, she felt Damon's fierce pride and approval, his wolf recognizing and celebrating the emergence of her true nature. "By the ancient laws you tried to use against me," she declared, her voice carrying to every corner of the ruined penthouse, "I invoke Luna's justice. You have threatened the Alpha King's mate, violated his territory, and endangered innocent humans in your obsession. The penalty is banishment from all pack territories, stripped of rank and protection, to live as a lone wolf until your dying day." The words blazed with supernatural authority, backed by powers older than civilization itself, and Marcus's face went white as bone as he realized the magnitude of her pronouncement. The other wolves in Marcus's pack immediately dropped to their knees, heads bowed in submission as they felt the weight of Luna Queen's judgment settling over them like chains. Several began to whimper and shift nervously, already distancing themselves from their former leader as his status evaporated like morning mist. Marcus himself seemed to shrink, his partial transformation reversing as the supernatural authority that had sustained his position as Pack Alpha was stripped away by forces beyond his comprehension. He was nothing now, less than nothing. A lone wolf without pack or protection in a world where such creatures rarely survived long. "Go," Seraphina commanded, pointing toward the destroyed doorway with a hand that no longer trembled with fear. "Run, as you made me run. Hide, as you made me hide. And know that if you ever appear in my sight again, I will not be so merciful." Marcus stumbled backward, his face a mask of disbelief and growing horror as the reality of his new existence crashed over him. The man who had terrorized her for 8 years fled like a whipped dog, his former followers scattering in his wake like leaves before a hurricane. In the silence that followed, Seraphina finally felt the crushing weight of fear lift from her shoulders, replaced by a power and confidence she had never dared to imagine. 6 months later, Seraphina stood on the balcony of the Pack's ancestral lodge, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that matched the contentment warming her chest. The mating mark on her throat had long since healed into an intricate silver scar that proclaimed her status to any supernatural being who saw it, but more importantly, the bond with Damon had deepened into something that felt as natural as breathing. She had found her voice in more ways than one, leading the Pack's Luna Council with a wisdom that surprised even herself, and for the first time in her adult life, she felt truly at peace. Damon's arms wrapped around her from behind as he joined her on the balcony, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched their territory wake to another day. The Pack house below bustled with activity, wolves preparing for the day's patrol, children laughing as they raced through the gardens, and the comfortable rhythm of a community that had accepted her completely as their Luna Queen. "No regrets," he murmured against her ear, though their bond carried his certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. The question had become their morning ritual, a gentle reminder of how far they had both traveled from that rain-soaked night in the coffee shop. "Never," she replied, leaning back into his warmth as she felt their future spreading out before them like an uncharted map. They had begun discussions about expanding the Pack territories, about modernizing some of the more archaic supernatural laws, and about the children they hoped to have once the immediate threats to their reign had been neutralized. Marcus had vanished completely after his banishment, though occasional reports reached them of a lone wolf terrorizing human settlements far from their territory. As long as he stayed away from her pack, Seraphina was content to let him live with the consequences of his obsession. The peace of the morning was shattered by the arrival of Damon's beta, rushing onto the balcony with the expression of barely controlled panic that made Seraphina's newfound security evaporate like smoke. "Alpha King, Luna Queen," he gasped, dropping to one knee in formal submission even as urgency radiated from every line of his body. "We've received a message from the European Council. They're coming to investigate your bonding, and they're bringing the bloodline hunters with them." The words hit like ice water, and through the bond, Seraphina felt Damon's protective rage spike as they both realized that their battles were far from over. The letter bore the ancient seal of the Council of Alphas, its wax black as midnight and thrumming with power that made her skin crawl. As Damon read the formal declaration aloud, Seraphina felt the foundations of her new world beginning to shift beneath her feet once again. The council had decided that her bloodline was too dangerous to remain unmated to a single alpha, no matter how powerful, and they were demanding she submit to evaluation to determine if she should be forced into multiple matings to dilute her genetic legacy. For the first time, Lily felt safe in Damon's arms, but in the shadows of the mountains, another pair of golden eyes had already chosen her fate.